This is an introduction to basic human anatomy and physiology. So you will need to know these two terms. First, anatomy. Anatomy is the branch of science that focuses on the parts of the body. It focuses on the study of the bodily structure. Now, we are primarily going to focus on humans, but anatomy can also address humans, animals, and other living organisms. While physiology is how things work, how those parts, how those muscles and bones work together and move. How do they work and function? So this is going to be the branch of science or the study that addresses the function of the body and its parts. So anatomy addresses the parts, name all the muscles, name all the bones, while physiology is what muscles allow you to move your arm. How does it work? These muscles do what? These bones do what? So we're primarily going to focus on both sides, both anatomy and physiology, but we will be using animals to help us identify and recognize the human anatomy and physiology. So we're going to try and use a lot of animals that are closely related to the structure and physiology of the human. Now, anatomy is divided into two parts. We have gross anatomy, which is what we can visually see with our naked eye. We can actually see the muscles, the bones, and the organs. So if I put a kidney, femur in front of you, you're going to be able to identify that. While microscopic anatomy is going to be what you can't see with your eye, but you need a microscope to see it. So this is going to be more of the muscle cells. So on the right of the slide here, we have a microscopic slide of smooth muscle tissue. And this is going to be dealing with cytology, which is cells. If I show you a skin cell, if I show you a nerve cell, these things we can't see with our eye. So we will be using the microscope this year to identify different cells and different tissues. And we will have to address the parts of the microscope and how to use a microscope properly. Now, ways we can study anatomy addresses regional anatomy and systemic anatomy. We're going to focus on systemic anatomy, which is one body system at a time, such as the skeletal system, muscular system, nervous system. So that's how I divided this course up. Regional anatomy would be, we're going to focus on the region of the head. So you'd have the skin, you'd have maybe the eyes, you'd have the tongue, you'd have the brain, you'd have the skull. Then you'd move into maybe the thoracic region, and you'd identify the heart and the lungs and the different muscles in this area. We're not going to do that. We're just going to kind of separate it up into skeletal system, memorize all the bones, see how they function. Then muscular system, memorize the muscles, see how they function. So we'll have it divided up in that way. So we're going to focus on systemic, which is body systems. Now let's look at the chemical composition of the human body, and we're going to take a look at this in more detail in a couple chapters from now, in which we're going to look at all the elements of the body and what foods we need to eat, and then we're going to look at biochemistry, the breakdown of carbs, proteins, and lipids, and what makes those molecular structures. So we'll look at that in more detail, but this is more of a foundation. So make sure you know the top four elements in order of the amount that is in your body. So hydrogen is 62%, oxygen 26%. That's one way you can remember it. They're kind of flipped, 62 and 26. And then carbon is 10% and nitrogen is 1.5%. Other elements besides those four, and we have calcium and phosphorus, potassium, sodium. So we'll be looking at those in the next couple chapters. Now, those were the top four elements. Looking at the top four compounds or molecules would be water at 67%. So the human body is a majority made up of water. Then we have proteins, 20%, fat, about 10%, and 3% carbohydrates. Now, I just want to address something that you should have learned in a previous life science or maybe earth science, is that the word compound and molecule are pretty much the same thing. when we're talking about different elements in a combined substance. So we have H2O. So we have two H's and one O. So we have two different elements. That could be referred to as a molecule. That could be referred to as a compound. But anytime we have something that is the same element, O2 or N2. N2 is two nitrogens. Then we have O2, which is two oxygens. They're the same element bonded together. That would not be considered a compound, but only a molecule. So be aware when we're talking about compounds and molecules, it can be interchangeably identified, such as water can be interchangeably identified as either a compound or a molecule. It's the same thing. It's made up of different elements. That can be a compound, that can be a molecule. But if I'm saying O2, the human breathes in O2, that would only be described as a molecule. So all compounds can be classified as molecules, but not all molecules can be compounds. Okay, we have the levels of organization in the human body. You should have learned this in life science. What we first are going to start with is the smaller substances. The atom is a submicroscopic particle that is going to be making up all matter in the universe. Make sure you're aware that an atom, and many of you have taken chemistry, the atom of an element would consist of protons, which would be a positive charge, which is in the nucleus, neutrons, also in the nucleus but has no charge, and electrons, which is technically in the orbital shell going around the nucleus, and that has a negative charge. So atoms then make up molecules. When those elements bond together, they're going to make up molecules, or we said compounds if they're both different. And those are going to be atoms, elements bonded together. When we have many of them, those are going to create macromolecules. So I could be identifying atom, then molecule, then macromolecule. I'm going to kind of keep macromolecule in this little category of molecule, macromolecule. Macromolecules are larger, and then macromolecules will then make up organelles. And organelles are like little tiny organs. These tiny membranous structures have a certain function. They're just like a little organ. So each organelle has a function, such as the mitochondria makes energy, the ribosome makes protein, the vacuole stores food or water or waste. So they all have a function. Then when we put all these organelles together, we have the cell, and the cell is the basic structural unit, functional unit of an organism. So we have a muscle cell, a neuron, an osteocyte. An osteocyte would be a bone cell. Then we have a skin cell. Now, for humans, cells cannot live on their own by themselves. We do know that protists and bacteria can be unicellular, living on their own, but that's not going to be the case for humans. Now, cells have to be grouped together to form a larger structure, which is a tissue. And tissues basically are these similar types of cells performing a certain function, a specific function. So we have many skin cells forming, a certain type of skin tissue, like the epithelial tissue. Maybe we have many adipose cells, fat cells, forming the adipose tissue, and so on. Now, tissues, when they're put together, they will make an organ. We have different tissues that will maybe create the heart, the liver, the lungs. Then when we have a group of organs together, that's going to be called an organ system. So those organs are all working together. So as we said, we're going to focus on systemic anatomy. That's going to be the skeletal system. Then when we have all these organs of the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, all the little peripheral nerves, these are going to be considered the nervous system. Then when we have all these organ systems put together, we have the living organism, the living human, which is an organism. Just a reminder from life science that humans are eukaryotic, meaning that they have, within each cell, they have membrane-bound organelles, and they have a nucleus that holds the DNA together inside. Now let's focus on the organ systems. We're first going to focus on the integumentary system. And this is actually going to be the first system that we are going to focus on after we learn about the cells and tissues. We're going to focus on the skin. Then we're going to move into the skeletal system, which focuses on the bones, which of course is going to be for movement, protection, and support. Bones also do make, in the bone marrow, it makes red blood cells. And also we have stem cells or stem cell production. Then we're going to move into the muscular system, and the muscles are for body movement and production of body heat. And those muscles are divided into 3 categories. Smooth muscle, which is involuntary, like your muscle, it digests without you thinking about it. You'll have skeletal muscle, which connects to your bones, allowing you to move your arms and legs. And then you're also going to have your cardiac. Your third type of muscle is your cardiac muscle, and that's for pumping the blood throughout your body. Then we'll move into the nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, all the different nerves throughout the body, branching off into your arms and your legs. And then as they move into your skin, this allows for heat, sensation of cold, pain. Then we're going to move into some systems that many people aren't familiar with, and this is the endocrine system, which contains glands that secrete hormones. There's the adrenal glands above your kidney. You have your thyroid glands in your neck area, and these hormones do stimulate chemical regulation. Then we have the cardiovascular or circulatory system, and we're going to kind of focus on the heart in the muscular system, but then we'll also kind of connect the heart with all the veins and arteries and capillaries as the heart and blood vessels work together to transport nutrients to the body cells, and that's when the capillaries drop off oxygen, pick up the waste, which is CO2. Then we have the lymphatic system, which is kind of part of the immune system. It secretes a lymph fluid. You have all your lymph nodes underneath your arm, on the inside of your legs. In your throat, you have your tonsils, which are partially shown lymph nodes, and this helps with immunity, and it kind of filters. It's kind of like a drainage system. Then you have the respiratory system. We primarily think of the lungs, but it's actually for breathing. It's the diaphragm that moves your lungs up and out by the pressure that it has created. But the respiratory system, the lungs, are very important for the pathway to transport the gas to your blood vessels and then pick up the waste, the CO2, and breathe it out. Then we have the digestive system, and we're going to learn about the alimentary canal, and then the organs that aren't part of the alimentary canal. So the alimentary canal is where food will pass through. The other organs like the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, these things, food doesn't pass through, but they do secrete digestive enzymes into the stomach or the small intestine. Then we have the renal or urinary systems. Renal means kidney. So the kidney is going to filter the waste from the blood and then pass it from your ureters to your urinary bladder, then out your urethra. And this is primarily going to help maintain chemical composition of the blood to get rid of a lot of the extra salts and sugars and water. Then we're going to end the year with the reproductive system, focusing on the human male and female reproductive systems. As you can see here, we have a total of 11 main systems. We're going to separate the 11 body systems into 12, as you can see in this picture, separating the reproductive system into, more specifically, the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. So if you go to the previous page, there was only 11 systems, but on this picture, we're showing you that we're separating the male from the female reproductive systems. Now we're going to focus on anatomical position. Anatomical position is standing straight up with your palms facing in front of you, and your thumbs are pointing outward away from you. Now, we're going to be also focusing on certain planes or sections of the body. We have the sagittal plane, which is a sagittal section, which divides the body into left and right sides. So the sagittal plane, left and right. The mid-sagittal is going to be specifically a type of sagittal plane that is specifically dividing it left from right, but it's going straight down the middle section of the body. So sagittal could be going through your shoulder up and down, separating left and right. Okay, that would be uneven. You have a larger section maybe on one side than the other. Mid-sagittal, though, is specifically an even, straight down the center. Left side is 50%, right side is 50%. Then we have the frontal plane that divides the body into front and back sides. So the frontal plane will go straight down, separating the front from the back. The frontal plane is also known as the coronal plane, and then we have the transverse plane, which cuts the body straight across, and this is going to be cutting it top from bottom. This is also known as the horizontal plane, so it's going to cut the body from top to bottom. Now, it doesn't matter necessarily where it is. Now, here's some anatomical terms you're going to need to know. You probably learned these in life science or biology, but we're going to address them again. The first one is anterior or ventral. In the human body, anterior and ventral means the front. But if we're talking about a dog, a cat, anterior and ventral have two different meanings because the dog or the cat would be on all four. Anterior would be the front, kind of where the face is, and then ventral would be the belly of the cat or dog. But with a human, we're not on all fours. We're standing straight up. So the front, the anterior, is also my belly region. So I can interchangeably identify anterior and ventral as the same thing for the human. And that's going to be very similar to posterior and dorsal. Remember, with the dog and cat, posterior was kind of the butt. Dorsal was the back. Think about a shark dorsal fin. It was the top. But with humans, my back is also where my butt is on that same side. So it's going to be behind or the back. So posterior and dorsal in the human will be the same area, same location. Then we're going to describe two terms, superior and inferior. Superior means at a higher position, while inferior means lower down the body. Then we're going to focus on lateral, which means on the sides of the body. So that is going to be very different from medial. Medial is going to be at the midpoint. So my ears are lateral, while my nose is medial. Then we're going to focus on proximal versus distal. Proximal refers to the position of the limb closer to the body trunk, while distal means further away. So this would be identifying my fingers versus my elbow. My fingers are more distal, while my elbow is more proximal. It's closer to the body trunk. My fingers are further away from the body trunk. Then we're going to contrast deep versus superficial. Deep refers to anything that is further from the surface. This is going to be primarily when we're going to be talking about the layers of the skin. So the top layer of the skin is going to be more superficial. Then we have the other layers all the way down to the subcutaneous layer or maybe the fat layer. This would be more deep as it's closer to the muscle. Here's an illustration that identifies not only the anatomical terms which we just talked about, such as medial, lateral, anterior, posterior, superior, inferior, but you can also see the sagittal plane, you can see the transverse plane, and you can see the coronal or frontal plane. Then we have the axial skeleton, which you can see is in green. That's going to be the skull, the vertebrae, the ribs, kind of the chest area. That's going to be the trunk of the body. Then when we talk about the appendicular skeleton, that's going to be all the bones that are coming off the trunk, the shoulder blades, the bones of the arm, the pelvis, the bones of the legs. So if you heard of appendages, the appendicular, these are the parts coming off of the main trunk. That's an appendage. Now we're going to focus on the anatomical body cavities, and these are going to use some of the terms that we just talked about to identify what it's going to be holding and its location. So the first one we have is dorsal. The dorsal body cavity, think about, is dorsal meaning back. It's the posterior cavity, posterior meaning back, behind. So this is the back cavity that contains the spine and the cranial cavities. So this is going to kind of hold the spinal cord and the brain. Now the dorsal cavity is going to be separated into the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. Okay, so the dorsal cavity holds the cranial and spinal cavities. When we're talking about just the cranial cavity, think about the cranium, that holds the brain. The spinal cavity, that holds the spinal cord. So that is going to be the dorsal, cranial, and spinal. So cranial and spinal are part of the dorsal. Now let's move into the ventral cavity. That cavity, that empty space, is anterior, it's front. Remember, ventral is belly. So it's the anterior cavity, and that's not just going to be the belly region, but it's going to be the chest and belly region. Okay, and the belly region is kind of divided into the abdominal and pelvic, which means the hips cavity. So the ventral cavity is going to be divided up into the thoracic cavity, which is the chest, and the chest contains two structural cavities. The pleural cavity, which holds the lungs, and then the pericardial, think of cardiac, holds the heart. So the thoracic cavity will be divided into the pleural cavity, which holds the lungs, and the pericardial cavity, which holds the heart. So far we have the ventral cavity is divided into thoracic and the abdominal pelvic, but the thoracic is divided into the pleural and pericardial. Now let's talk about the abdominal pelvic. The abdominal pelvic is also divided into two cavities. The abdominal cavity, which is going to be your stomach, liver, your upper abdomen, kind of right below your diaphragm. And then you have your pelvic. And you can see in the illustration, you can see the dorsal cavity being divided into the cranial spinal cavity. You can see the ventral or anterior cavity being divided into your thoracic, pericardial. You can see the pleural on the right diagram for your lungs. You can see your abdominal pelvic. You can see the abdominal region up there, the pelvic at the bottom. Now our last section of these notes today are going to focus on the abdominal quadrants, which quad meaning 4, and the 9 abdominal regions. So if you do some research, some textbooks, some resources just divide the lower abdominal area into 4 parts. You have the right upper quarter or quadrant. You have the right lower quarter or quadrant. And then you have the left upper and then the left lower. So these are more general, but we're going to actually get into more detail and we're going to focus on the 9 abdominal regions. So we're going to kind of divide these 4 quadrants up a little more into 9 areas. So we're going to focus on 3 top going across, 3 middle going across, and then 3 lower going across. So 3 times 3 is going to give us 9. These are going to be more specific. This is going to focus on the hypochondric Chondro means cartilage. Hypo means below. So we have the right and left hypochondric. So this actually means right below the ribs, right below the cartilage of the ribs. So this is the upper abdominal, kind of like if you put your hand kind of right underneath your ribs, okay, your upper section of your abs. That's what we're going to be talking about. Now, we have the right and then we have the left. Now, remember, we're dividing this upper area into three parts, not two. So we're not just going to have a right and left, we're going to have a middle. Now, the epigastric, epi meaning top, and this is above or top of the gastric, and gastric means stomach. So this is kind of like where your ribs kind of separate or dip up. That area right there, that will be the epigastric region. Now let's look at the next lower or right below the hypochondriac region. So this is the middle group of three. So we have the right lumbar, and lumbar actually means lower back. So when we talk about my lumbar region, this is my lower back region. So if we follow the lower back to the front, that's kind of like where my belly button is. But we're talking about right and left of the belly button. And then we have the umbilical kind of region, which is the square that kind of covers that belly button. And that's the umbilical region. The umbilical means navel or belly button. Now, navel means middle. And that's why if you ever heard of the word navel referring to your belly, that's the middle of your abdominal, okay? Umbilical refers to the umbilical cord attachment at your belly button. So this is going to be the very center. So if you're ever playing bingo, that would be like the bingo center that you always get for free. Now let's go to the very bottom three. We have the right iliac, left iliac, and iliac refers to the parts of your hip that kind of are the fans or the crest of your hip. So your ilium is your upper hip of your pelvis. Now, iliac or inguinal refers to the groin area. If someone said they pulled their groin or they stretched the kind of the muscles in that area, that's going to be kind of on the inside of their legs. Then we have the hypogastric. Hypo, as we said already, is below. So this is below the gastric, and remember gastric refers to stomach. So this is the center below the stomach, kind of below the belly button. And remember, if you have any questions or you need any more explanation than what I'm sharing in this lecture, please email me on the day of your lecture if you have any questions, and I will email you as soon as I see your email. Thank you.